Hello, my name is Elisha Johnson, and I am a senior music education major here at the University of Central Arkansas. And this is my honors college thesis. It just happened, and it kept happening forever, a case study of cultivating Black representation in classical music. With a simple Google search of top orchestras in the United States, many photos will look very similar to this one, predominantly white. As a Black woman in classical music, I have often wondered why there are not many musicians or music teachers who look like me. At my university in the fall of 2020, there were 160 music majors. 43 were people of color, 17 were Black, and I was one of 2 Black female brass players. I have often found myself living in a world of double consciousness, confused and conflicted about my identity and how others view me. Talking about race and racism gives me some fear and anxiety as a Black woman. I never want to be perceived as a commonly used stereotype, the angry Black woman. At the beginning stages of my thesis, I wanted to alleviate that discomfort by focusing more broadly on the lack of racial and gender diversity in classical music. However, I realized that I was ultimately silencing my struggles as a Black woman, similar to the way many white institutions ignore, downplay, or pretend as though Black discrimination does not exist. I want this research to be a guide towards making the classical music field more equitable and inclusive for the Black community, especially for the younger generation. To gain more context of this issue, it is important that I give you some historical context. In 1863, the first white-only musician unions formed. This provided protection and special services for their advancement in the field. In predominantly Black cities, Black musicians also took action and formed their own unions. Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that racial segregation was constitutional and established a separate but equal doctrine, which encouraged unions to become permanently homogeneous spaces. Many unions were segregated for over 70 years, even after Brown versus Board of Education, which ruled that racial segregation is indeed unconstitutional and unequal. During that time, orchestras announced job openings to white musicians only. In the 1970s, American orchestras adopted blind auditions in an effort to combat the racial and gender disparity and focus solely on a musician's playing abilities. Blind auditions did promote change in terms of gender, but have yet to provide racial equity in orchestra membership. This comes from a 2014 report that included data over 500 orchestras across the country, and it was divided into subgroups by position in the field, such as musicians, as you see here, conductors, and board members. The numbers of Black individuals in orchestras remained very low throughout 12 years. Researchers have revealed many barriers in the educational system that might also lead to racial disparities in the classical music field. One major factor is that students who reside in low socioeconomic areas are not provided with the best education and resources to be able to excel or participate in music. Another cause is due to the lack of representation in teachers. This is partly due to the cultural biases of the teacher's licensing exam. Representation in the curriculum is also a neglected area that affects the engagement and enrollment of Black students. Study shows that classical music remains predominantly white due to the history and segregation and many barriers Black individuals face. This research is an embedded case study of a nonprofit organization called the Prism Ensemble. There were 3 units of analysis based on the participants' roles within the ensemble. I personally participated in Prism as a high schooler. Prism has allowed me to feel uniquely seen as a Black woman in the classical music field. These are the founders of Prism, Lacolian and Corinna Washington. For many years, the Washingtons attended the South African Music Festival and saw many similarities in the demographics and segregation in their community. The Washingtons were impressed with the production of the festival and how it provided access and opportunities for the musicians there. In 2005, the Washingtons became inspired to develop the Prism Ensemble based in Memphis, Tennessee. Prism was initially a touring and performing chamber group, but evolved into a student-centered music festival that included an educational component and a concert series. The Washingtons' values of diversity, access, and opportunities for underrepresented communities remain the driving force of the organization today. I interviewed 24 people who were involved with the organization as either a member of the board of directors, professional musicians, or an alumni student. More than half of my participants were people of color. Prism puts their words into action, serving as a great model of what the classical music world should value and look like. Participants in this case study revealed 3 themes that further explain why there is a lack of Black representation in classical music and what Prism is doing to combat this issue. It is important to identify the specific barriers that many Black individuals face today. Oppression is a system established in multiple layers, personal, structural, and systemic, that may be difficult for few to see. Due to personal and structural barriers, many Black individuals are prevented from succeeding and participating in classical music. All the participants agreed that there was a lack of representation in classical music, and a couple of participants spoke specifically about the difference between diversity and anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness is not an often used term. Lacolian describes diversity in classical music as an issue that does not pertain to gender or to other races, but specifically Black people. The participants spoke about many things Prism is intentionally implementing for Black communities. For recruitment and retention of Black students, Prism provided programs in middle schools and high schools to provide students with high-level music teaching and performance for predominantly Black and brown students, which were also places where music education was either not thriving or not available for these students. Prism is a strong advocate for representation in the classical music field. Prism had representation in not only race, but age, language, gender, religion, social backgrounds, and even in the repertoire for the concerts, as Lacolian explains.
Just the way that we thought about concert programs, because people feel like repertoire is like this really difficult nut to crack as it relates to diversifying it and being more representative, and like it was like super easy for us. It was like a decision we made one day, and then it just happened and kept happening forever. Like it wasn't like, oh my God, how are we gonna? It wasn't like that at all. It was.
The Prism was aware of many barriers families in Memphis face, such as financial barriers, lack of transportation, or quality instruments, and they quickly found ways to combat those obstacles to allow students to have access to classical music. Many alumni students expressed how, without Prism's help financially, they would have not been able to attend the music camps. The Prism Ensemble's mission also centers around providing opportunities in musical development and experiences for underserved populations. Students in Prism have the opportunity to play side by side in a chamber ensemble with the guest professional musicians. Throughout the week, the festival, the professional musicians perform chamber recitals for the students. Elisha, a professional musician within Prism, spoke about her experiences with a particular student who grew confident in his playing.
Week I was working with, there was one oboe player, right? And he was young, but he was good, but he was young. So I, was playing first oboe and he was playing second. And then at the end of the first week, he really improved. Like, we had our private lessons as well. And I was just like, you know what? You should play principal in the orchestra and I'll play second. And he was like, what? And I was like, yeah, you do that because I think you're ready. You can play this. You can play this repertoire. And so he did, and it was the first time he tuned an orchestra, you know, because as the oboe player, you have to tune the orchestra. So it was the first time he did that, and he had some little solos here and there, and he sounded so good on them, and I was so proud of him. I just thought that his improvement and his, like, you know, self-confidence, really, because he was very, like, I can't do that, you know. But when he showed up in the orchestra, when he showed up in his quintet, it was really cool to see that as a teacher.
Lastly, the participants felt that Prism really knew how to create spaces that felt inclusive and allowed everyone to build authentic relationships. Music educator Joyce McCall was inspired to cultivate activism in the classroom and in educators' daily lives. She referred this as being creative activists. Prism is an organization that advocates for change, and many participants do the same in their workplaces and communities. Cultural humility is a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique whereby the individual not only learns about another's culture, but one starts with an examination of his or her own beliefs and cultural identities. Prism influenced many of the participants to have difficult conversations about issues in society and identify their own implicit biases. The professional musicians engaged with many Black communities and outreach programs and organizations. Some provided access to classical music through free lessons, and others also commissioned and performed pieces by composers of color. The identification and dismantling of barriers in classical music has created a space where Black musicians are welcome, encouraged, and represented in Prism. Prism established intentional actions that contributed to making an environment where Black students can see themselves and envision their professional future in music. Prism develops creative activists who implement these practices into their own musical communities to effect change. There is a growing body of research that presents similar findings and implications for making the classical music field more accessible and inclusive for Black people. Many participants in this case study talked about how implicit biases became a barrier towards making the classical music field more diverse, inclusive, and equal for Black musicians, such as white individuals saying that they were surprised by the quality of Black performances in Prism. This suggests that many white individuals expect a lower quality from Black musicians. A study revealed that the judges scored Black performers notably lower than white performers. Implicit biases can alter one's perception about Black musicians just based on the color of their skin. The most significant structural barrier associated with the participation and retention of Black students in music was socioeconomic status. Prism eliminated any barrier that may cause a student to not attend their programs. These external factors are out of students' control, and music educators should find ways to alleviate these burdens. Prism is rich in not just diversity, but with great representation of Black people. Other orchestras may see that they have a growing trend of other cultures and claim to be diverse while missing the Black representation. This misrepresentation is consistent and perpetual through the U.S. history, and orchestras are no exception. Representation matters for students in K-12 education, and Prism makes this their goal. Prism is unique in how they recruit students of all ages and engage with Black communities. One researcher argued that music institutions need to recruit and retain more people of color by providing equitable access and opportunities in music. To best represent Memphis, Prism hired quality musicians of color. A study specifically mentioned implementing some version of the National Football League's Rooney's Rule, whereby auditions or job interviews could not begin without having a certain number of Black candidates. Other studies have shown that same race and same gender teachers in both music and non-music disciplines have a higher success rate with their students of color. The professionals of Prism engaged and created relationships with the students that make the space feel safe and inclusive. One researcher discussed the role of the teacher and how incorporating students' cultural identities provides a strong, rich foundation of music teaching and learning. Prism strongly advocates for familiarizing their students to music by people of color, and some of the professional musicians spoke about how it was mandatory to have representative repertoire. The alumni students expressed how this made music playing much more musically rewarding. One researcher argued that multicultural or ethnic activities that involve everyone promote a curriculum that enhances respect, learning, and appreciation of all cultures, which can be referred to as culturally responsive teaching. The choices music educators make in their music repertoire selections communicates how much they value culturally relevant teaching and what music they feel is important to study. In Prism, gaining cultural humility was more emphasized by the professional musicians and the board members through their trainings. The students benefited from these practices even though they were not aware of the conversationings happening in the background. One researcher suggested that engaging in conversations about race, colonialism, and institutionalized whiteness would also break the homogeneity in music education spaces. This exposure can allow the students to develop cultural humility and become individuals who truly value diversity, belonging, inclusion, and equity. These implications for music education are a pathway towards becoming creative activists. The professional musicians expressed how they were influenced to advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion in their own communities, and became more than just musicians. K-12 educators should strive not only to teach, but to also be an advocate for their students and their communities. The more educators and performing musicians become creative activists, the closer classical music will truly become diverse, equitable, and inclusive for Black people. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for listening to my thesis, and I am so grateful to be selected into this conference.